There are many kinds of fog at Fort Monroe. The fog that drifts in from the Chesapeake Bay overnight. But there's also a fog of memory and history as we try to recover the remarkable events that unfolded on this landscape. What if I told you that this was the place where the first Africans arrived in what would become the United States of America? And what if I told you this very same place is the place where a vast system of slavery began to unravel? And what if I told you that this is a place where, even today, people are working to remember those crucial parts of the American past? I'm a historian of the American South and American slavery, so I have to admit that I find this place especially evocative. I grew up in East Tennessee, and frankly, I had no interest in history as a kid. It always seemed to me that history was something that happened to somebody else, certainly somewhere else. I was busy with the usual stuff of rock music and cars, but when I got to college, I realized that some people make careers out of explaining ourselves to ourselves. Then I went to graduate school, and when I was confronted with the misconceptions about the South, I decided to study Southern history. For 40 years now, I've taught thousands of students and written books about slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction. I've tried in various ways to capture the richness and complexity of the American past through creating digital archives or helping to establish museums and co-hosting a podcast. And throughout, I've studied people who are not like myself. Sometimes they're of different races or different genders, certainly of different times. Why would I do that? Because it strikes me that it's important to get outside of ourselves, to see our country through different eyes. So Terry.
Yes.
Where are we here?
We're at Fort Monroe.
Fort. Well, I feel like we're at a house here. How's this a fort?
It was a fort for nearly 2 centuries. This served as a military installation. They started construction in the early 1800s. It took about 25 to 30 years to build this fort. And it's a strategic location. You have the James and York River meeting at the Chesapeake. Right. And if you were to drive through the front gates today, you would see a guard shack, and it looks and feels like a military base. Right. It served that function for a number of years. But as you drive around, you see some of the old buildings. There are even restaurants here. There's beautiful view sheds. But when you begin to scratch the surface a little bit, there's archaeological evidence that American Indians were in this area almost 10,000 years ago.
Wow.
We do know that the early explorers, Captain John Smith and Christopher Newport, was in this area. And shortly after they arrived, the first Africans in English North America arrived right here at Fort Monroe, and that the contraband decision was made right here at this fort.
The contraband decision?
Yes, the
What's
contraband
that?
Decision. Well, it was during the Civil War. You know, Virginia ceased from the Union, and this fort remains in Union control. And in the middle of the night, there are 3 men, Frank Baker, James Townsend, and Shepard Mallory. They arrive at the main gate. Now, what is important here is that there's a fugitive slave law in place. You run away from your master, they have the right to come and get you. So that's a very dangerous venture they're on. They don't know whether or not they're going to be given asylum or taken back. But the general here, General Butler, decides to keep them here. That little decision leads to the next day about 7 people showing up.
Huh.
And then the following day, about 49. And then by October, 900, and then eventually thousands and thousands of enslaved people made their way to Fort Monroe.
And they come in the fort, and the fort gives them sanctuary.
Yes. That is like dropping a rock in the middle of a lake. It has a ripple effect.
Right, right.
And it leads to all kinds of decisions, legal policies, and eventually the Emancipation Proclamation.
The main gate at Fort Monroe witnessed a tense and quiet scene that would shape much of what followed. The 3 enslaved men, dressed in the clothes that they'd been wearing to dig fortifications for the Confederacy, appeared, seeking refuge. And a young sentry from Vermont had to decide whether to give these men admission to the fort.
It's an amazing moment in history when they knock on this door and they arrive here and they ask for asylum. It gives me goosebumps. Shortly thereafter, the word gets out that there is an opportunity here. This is a place of freedom
First time in their life, there's a place to go that's not slavery. And so they were coming from the countryside for many miles around, right?
Absolutely.
And they hear that there's this refuge,
Yes.
right? And what do they call this?
What do they call this?
Yeah.
This was called Freedom's Fortress. And just imagine this, there's no cell phones. The word gets around by word of mouth. And they are running and walking and they're jumping on boats to get here.
Wow.
And it's an amazing scene.
So you have a fort with the United States Army here trying to take Virginia back, right,
Yes.
into the United States. And these thousands of formerly enslaved people come here. It was not really built for that, right?
It was not. Conditions were horrible. There was disease. There was, you know, people trying to figure out how to find their families.
So basically, it's a refugee camp
It's a refugee camp.
in the middle of a fort.
And the truth of the matter is, Fort Monroe is just the start of it all. They would eventually branch out into the community. They built a community around this fort. When you drive through Hampton, these communities are still there. The essence of the people who started here are still there.
Terry told us that the story of this place is both inspiring and grim. That's because it's the site where slavery began to unravel, but it's also the site where the first Africans landed in British North America. I met with Calvin Pearson to learn more about some of the earliest history at this place.
So today we are here at Fort Monroe, Virginia. In 1619, it was called Point Comfort. So when the settlers arrived in 1607, this was the fishing village, a little small spit of land. But in 1619, Point Comfort was the point of entry for all ships entering the harbor.
So what do we know about the first Africans who arrived here in 1619?
What we found out was those first Africans who were captured and brought here were from Angola. They were bound for Veracruz, Mexico. They were going to be slaves in the silver mines for life. Originally, there were 350 Africans on the original slave ship that left Angola. 2 pirate ships attacked the ship in the Gulf of Mexico, and they took 60 of the healthiest Africans and brought them here. 2 of them, Anthony and Isabella, became servants in the household of the captain. Within a couple of years, Anthony and Isabella had the first documented African child born in English North America.
Wow.
Even today, we have descendants of those first Africans who are still living here in Hampton.
Starting more than a decade ago, Calvin organized the first of what's now an annual event to mark the moment when it's documented that the first Africans appeared in British North America. It's called African Landing Day.
So what we tell people when they come here today and in past years and in the future is that this is a commemoration. It's not a celebration. We do not celebrate slavery. Of course. This is a commemoration of the arrival of the first Africans. But we also want to celebrate 400 years of history.
Right.
Because if you look at a people who are brought here against their will and in chains, who eventually helped build this great nation, this is still our country too. This is a sacred place for us. When we walk these grounds, we feel the spirit of our ancestors. So that's why it's so special to us.
With a place as rich in history as Fort Monroe, the past comes to us in many forms. And that's why I wound up in a brewery here. People are now brewing beer based on the yeast from Benjamin Butler's mess kit.
It was actually a beautiful one, believe it or not. There you are, sir.
Thank you so much. Russ, we're in a brewery on Fort Monroe. Were you inspired to have the history focus because you're at a historical place?
I've always been kind of obsessed with the idea of trying to take yeast off of something and culturing it up and putting it into one of our beers. We started throwing around the idea of swabbing Benjamin Butler's mess chest. It has all this dinnerware, silverware, glasses.
Was it kept under glass, is my understanding?
It was, yeah, it was. It's been under glass for quite a while, so.
So that was the main thing that was appealing to you, right? Is that you could say this really is historic.
Right.
This is not just something that just lasts 30 or 40 years,
Exactly,
right?
and it's not something that many people had access to, so the fact that we were able to access it and try and culture something off of it was pretty cool to us.
The beer is really excellent, I must say, and it's weird to think that I'm tasting something literally as a living connection
to something over 150 years ago.
Exactly.
From this exact place on the earth.
Exactly.
That's pretty amazing.
We want to tell the story, we want to tell the history. He is connected to one of the greatest things that has ties to our area, which is the contraband decision back during the Civil War. And a lot of people don't even know that it happened. Honestly, that's the most intriguing thing for us as well, is that you literally can drink history.
Now, clearly, this takes not just a vision, but also science. And Rachel, who earned her college degree in chemistry, told me that this was an experiment that she'd wanted to tackle for years.
When I joined on, this is something that I really wanted to do. I had seen one other brewery do it, and they had basically isolated a yeast strain, and they used it in their beer. And it's also how a majority of the brewing yeast strains come to life, too.
How much of the taste of beer is determined by its yeast?
A large portion of it. Beer is a very complex thing. People don't quite understand it. You can change several aspects of the brewing process. Everything you do and every little thing that you tweak is going to make your beer taste different.
But none of them taste as good, I bet, as Ben Butler's mess kit. Tell me about that.
We started off by communicating with the Casemate Museum and seeing if they would let us come in and swab a bunch of their stuff. And they were actually okay with us coming in and swabbing General Butler's dining chest. From here, it's all in the lab.
After waiting more than 150 years, Uzzell Finch figured they could wait a few more months to taste this beer. Head brewer Mike took it into barrels, and he's working on a new batch now.
So I'm responsible for production overall at the brewery, which means executing Russell's vision with Rachel's help. Then it becomes my job to figure out, can it ferment beer, and more importantly, can it ferment beer that tastes good?
Right. And how do you know?
Trial and error.
How many different variables do you have to control all the time?
A lot.
Or do you live with the variables? It's not so much controlling them.
A little bit of both. A little bit of both. I think that my job is to put yeast and bacteria in a situation where it can be successful.
Now, rumor has it that that nail actually holds the beer behind it.
It does.
And that there is a kind of a dramatic episode when you extract that nail. Would it be possible to see what that looks like?
Absolutely. And why don't we go ahead, if we can, why don't we pull off of this barrel below, which is where the actual casemate yeast
It would seem to be historically authentic.
Yes.
And we're all about that, so let's do it.
All right. There's your dramatic explosion of beer.
Got to be quick.
And there you go.
Wow. So would I be able to taste this?
You absolutely can. It's going to be warm and still.
Excellent. If it were not still and if it were cooler, it would be perfect. Matt, how you doing?
Ed, very nice to see you.
So, right here in this field.
We are.
What is this?
We're at the site of an archaeological investigation that my company performed in 2014. We were contracted by the city and the Hampton History Museum to do a preliminary archaeological investigation to see if we could find any physical evidence, any archaeological remains of the Grand Contraband camp, which we believe had been on this site.
So really, how could we lose a contraband camp with thousands of people? How could we not know where it was?
The city of Hampton had been burned by the retreating Confederate forces in August of 1861. And at that point, the city was in ruins, and many of the contrabands who were arriving in this area basically took up residence in the ruins of the former town of Hampton.
Emancipation is not a Union war aim for the first 2 years that all this is developing. It's that black people are saying, yeah, work that out later. I'm getting away from this plantation. I'm going to make myself free. And this is kind of the embodiment of what that looked like.
Well, that's right, and that's an issue that landed on their doorstep. And I think that we wouldn't want to exaggerate the influence that the military or the Union government had on these settlements. I think what we're starting to see, even through the archaeology, is that these settlements, in many cases, emerged organically, and although there was certainly assistance from the federal government, the military and northern voluntary organizations, they were essentially left to their own devices to make a living, build their own shelter, create an economy. We read about stores and other commercial establishments springing up, owned by African Americans to serve the community.
All of the artifacts that Matt and his team collected are now preserved at the Hampton History Museum. We went to the museum's archives to see them firsthand.
When we did the archaeological study, we recovered literally hundreds of artifacts, all dating to the mid-19th century period. So these would have been used by people living in the Grand Contraband camp or the people who owned the lots in the early 1870s, African American.
So how deeply do you need to dig to start finding this evidence of history?
Surprisingly, not deeply at all. Really about a foot of topsoil or less. We scraped away with a backhoe, found the surface of these subsurface features like trash pits and root cellars, and in excavating those, we recovered these artifacts. So we have evidence of laboring activities. We know that many of the contraband men living in the camp worked for the Union Army as laborers, and so we have this axe head here.
No, it's not
which
a rock,
someone may
it's
have
an
used.
axe head.
It's actually corroded iron axe head. You
Yeah.
can feel the weight
Right.
of it. Now here we have a fairly well intact pair of scissors,
Wow.
you can tell. So probably more likely used by one of the women in the contraband camp. We also have a lot of evidence of their diet at the time. As you can imagine, being in Hampton, it's rich with oysters. We found a lot of oyster shell. This is a little bit bigger than that. This is a cow bone, so that's been butchered, and so someone has been eating beef on the site.
What do you wish you had found? Is there a smoking gun or something you wish you
What I would say is the goal of what we were doing was to see whether there was any potential at all for surviving intact remains of the Grand Contraband camp. So even though our investigation was relatively limited, we did determine it is there. It is intact. It's less than a foot below the modern ground surface. If we had the opportunity to go back and expand our area of investigation, we could ask all sorts of interesting questions.
So this is really interesting, especially to people who are interested in history. But what do you say to people who say, well, yeah, but this would slow down progress. We don't really have time to dawdle over things like this.
We don't have to slow progress at all. And archaeology, by its very nature, is a destructive process. As we do these excavations, we're removing history from the ground, and in that sense, we've essentially cleared the path for development. So it doesn't have to be an either-or. We can certainly gain the information and understand more about our history and our archaeological resources and still have progress at the same time.
And whatever Hampton's going to become in the future, it will always have been the place where people made themselves free.
That's
right?
exactly right.
It seems like such a special possession to have and to unearth and to share. The men, women, and children who fled to Fort Monroe for freedom also sought work and education. Hampton University was founded in 1868, only 3 years after the Civil War, for the explicit purpose of educating black people to become teachers and to work in agriculture and industry. The Hampton University Museum was founded that exact same year because the university's founders considered it important that the institution's history be documented. As a result, it's the oldest African-American museum in the country.
How you doing today?
Great, I'm so great. How are you, sir?
I'm terrific, and we're in a very powerful place.
We are.
Where are we? Tell us about this.
We are on sacred ground. Here is where Emancipation Oak, as it is called, one of the great oaks in the world, according to National Geographic magazine.
believe it, yeah.
Yes, not only because of its statue, really, but because of what it came to mean to people of African descent right before the Civil War. There was this really beautiful woman named Mary Smith Kelsey Peak, born and raised in Norfolk. And she was born of a white father and a black mother. And she didn't run away from that.
Right. Because she could have just left Virginia.
She could have.
Right.
She could have. And she was educated in Northern Virginia.
Yeah.
And what she would do would be against the law, Virginia law, which prohibited black people from learning how to read or write, whether they were free or enslaved.
Right, right.
But she was a determined woman, and she decided to teach black people how to read and write. And eventually her mother married, and they relocated to Hampton. And so this is how she was able to get to Hampton. And she began to teach black adults and children how to read and write.
And this is all before the Civil War.
This is all before the Civil
Right.
War. It's amazing. And the first reading in the South of the Emancipation Proclamation occurred here.
We're standing underneath the Emancipation Oak, so apparently somebody kept the flame burning? How
Absolutely.
did that happen?
Well, she was one of the first teachers, if not the first teacher, that the American Missionary Association hired to really begin to teach formally, openly, black men, women, and children. The American Missionary Association's efforts were the beginning foundation of what we know Hampton University to be today.
Wow.
And so that's how Mary Peak is connected to Hampton
In some
University.
ways, Hampton University grew around this moment,
grew
this
around
tree.
this tree. I think we talk about freedom only in a sense of escaping from a physical place,
Right,
a plantation or a workhouse. But freedom, I think the point that we're missing really is what you are able to do to live out your cultural self, to be able to attend to your needs mentally and emotionally, and is to live
be
life on your terms.
emancipated in every
way.
Right.
And this space represents that, I think, for generations to come.
It's so inspiring, too, that a woman, it's a woman,
Yeah,
too,
absolutely.
overcame every obstacle, that the society could put in her way and create something that has this enduring consequence. I can't help but notice that there's an interstate highway, what, maybe 200 yards away with lots of traffic on it. What does that tell us?
That the highway gets in the way of history. When the highway was constructed, unfortunately, it cut across this sacred space because this ground was really connected to a contraband camp, Zion Baptist Church, on the other side of the highway, which was a part of the legacy of the developing African-American community post-Emancipation Proclamation, post-enslavement.
Right, right.
So Zion Baptist Church is one of the contraband churches founded 1862-63 here in the city
it should be part of the same site.
Absolutely. It's a sacred tree.
Now, one thing I find encouraging as a historian is how passionate so many families are about tracing their ancestry. But for some families, that history is more difficult to trace than for others. For African American families, there's often little or no documentation about when their ancestors were forcibly captured and transported to North America. So I was intrigued to see a family wearing matching T-shirts at African Landing Day, noting they were descendants of William Tucker. Now, Tucker, they told me, is likely the first black child born in America. So you might say he's the first African-American person. I wanted to learn from the Tucker family how they drew the remarkable connections with the past.
We've always known a connection with a ship that brought our ancestors into this Point Comfort. We didn't know as much. It was an oral history.
Right.
We did research, extensive research, and I submitted my DNA to have it tested and get the results, and it was very favorable, leading us to believe that we were on the right track. My father always said that, look, people are watching you. You are somebody. Put your best foot forward. And so we lived up to that, and he always shared with us that you are from proud people. That's what he said so many times.
So what does this ceremony mean for you folks?
Just to learn everything that's happening, everything we didn't know. We don't really learn about Africa in school, and you basically just learn of the little things.
Well, the fact that your family's been here for 400 years and maintaining a connection with it is remarkable, and now you're all over the country doing all these great things. What do you think your story tells America?
First thing that comes to mind is, as we were saying, there have been things that we didn't know. So many people, not only our family, but the world. And it's important to connect those dots, cross those T's, and so that we can all understand and love the rich history that makes up America. There's so many angles to that story, and it's time that we learn more.
Well, that's what's exciting to me, is that we're just at the beginning of the journey of actually understanding American history, you know? And your family really shows that it's important to have kept the pilot light burning all these years, and now let the flame grow for everybody.
As Fort Monroe prepared to mark 400 years since African people first arrived here, I spoke again with Superintendent Terry Brown to learn about his hopes for this site.
I want people to embrace the diversity of stories here. They take us from the early arrival of Africans all the way to World War II. And I think if people walk away feeling inspired and angry and upset and also proud, we have done something here.
Well, if you imagine people going to the place where the first Africans arrived, it's a reflective place as well. It's a place you could actually think about what it meant, you know, for the 400 years since then.
That's what I'm talking about, is people taking a moment to look at the space, taste it and feel it and just be immersed in it. That's what this is all about. That's why we preserve these great spaces.
Coming up this season on the future of America's past.
Our history is the definition of who we are.
There is a hunger for the truth, because the truth is healing.
Who we consider ourselves to be.
It's not just walls, bricks and mortar.
And who we can become.
They're getting what I didn't get. They're getting the full story.
Join me and let's discover the future of America's past.